The Americans and Chinese gloves are off. Do you think we are now heading into a new Cold War?
Well, we are certainly in a period of really terrible US-China relations, and they've been getting worse for years. And this year in particular, as the pandemic hit, and even frankly in the last few weeks, things have got worse and worse.
China has taken over the premises of the US consulate in the southwestern city of Chengdu. It ordered the diplomatic mission there to close in response to the United States closing the Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas last week.
Do I think it's a new Cold War? Well, I have some issues with the framing Cold War. The old Cold War was between the USSR and the USA. The USSR, Soviet Union, very important nuclear power, ideological foe, but frankly, economic minnow. The difference with China is that China is a huge economy with which we're very integrated. So I'm not sure the phrase is the right one, but yes, we are heading to very, very worrying relationship between these two countries.
Now, before we get into what's at stake, I kind of want to go back a bit, because if we think about 1989 and the wall came down, the Soviets had their Gorbachev, but the Chinese, Tiananmen Square, very different lesson, right? We didn't win that.
I think two very important things happened in 1989. One, as you say, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, and with it, the sense that the US had won the Cold War. And, Frank Fukuyama publishes The End of History with a question mark, and there is a sense of, the ideological supremacy of Western liberalism is there, and there's that kind of unipolar moment, US reigns supreme. The other thing that happened, as you say, in 1989 was Tiananmen Square. And I think what we're realizing now is that what happened in Tiananmen Square actually is sort of, the shadow of that is driving the early 21st century much more than the aftermath of the hubristic moment of 1990 in the sense of US, unipolarity. So, you're right that the expectation was, I think in 1990s, 2000s, that as China integrated into the world economy, China would be created that would be a responsible stakeholder that would, the most optimistic people hoped, become a more democratic, more liberal place. The expectation in some sense was that what had happened in other parts of the post-Cold War world would happen in China. And I think what we've learned is that gamble, that expectation has been proved wrong. China has indeed grown extraordinarily. The most amazing, poverty reduction we've ever seen, the world has ever seen, an unbelievable increase in standards of living. The Chinese economy has grown dramatically, but it has not really become, in important ways, a responsible economic stakeholder. And at the same time, and now increasingly under President Xi Jinping, really obviously, it's becoming, if anything, more authoritarian.
So we think about what's happening now, and you put a very clear point that the Americans and Chinese do need each other. Do you think, right now in the United States, being hawkish on China, is almost the only game in town? Do you think that's appropriate? And if so, how much so?
There has been in the US over the past few years a growing recognition on both sides of the aisle that the old approach wasn't working, that at a kind of level of trade and the economy narrowly, China wasn't playing by the rules, and that integration and into access to the WTO hadn't really changed China. At the same time, it was catching up very dramatically and very rapidly in technology. And it is an authoritarian regime. And so there was a kind of, realization in the US that all those three put together that rather than being a kind of strategic partner, America suddenly thought of China as a strategic competitor, and a rather worrying one. And so the question I think that the US has been grappling with, and everybody else sort of by extension, is how do you deal with a country with which your economies are extremely integrated? Think of global supply chains, think of the number of companies that produce things in China, think of the integration. And so how can you safely continue that integration, continue that interaction with a country whose ideology you absolutely don't share and that you fundamentally don't trust? And I think what the US has been going through in the past 3-4 years, accentuated by the president and the Trump administration, because as so often, President Trump, in a kind of somewhat clumsy and transactional and crude way, identifies a real issue then and we can talk about this, but I think has not necessarily gone about trying to deal with it in the right way, but certainly shone a spotlight on it. And at the same time, I think, and it really has been the last 3 to 4 years, this hardening on both sides of the aisle in the US of attitudes toward China.
President Nixon once said he feared he had created a Frankenstein by opening the world to the CCP. And here we are.
But what I don't think we have yet is a consensus or indeed a kind of strategic sense about how you go from the old world where you hope that integrating with China would make it a responsible stakeholder to managing relations with a country with which you are integrated but which you no longer trust. So the simple, which is kind of why I find this metaphor of the new Cold War or this adage not that helpful, because the new Cold War suggests, well, it'll be like the old Cold War. You know, we'll have nuclear deterrence, we'll have military buildup, we'll disentangle our economies. But let's just think through what that means. It means really an unwinding of a lot of the globalization we've had so far. It means, what does it mean for third countries? What does it mean for countries in Europe? What does it mean for countries in the emerging world who have very close links with both economies? So I think we haven't really thought through how to do it, let alone how do we deal with the kind of common challenges we all face, and the pandemic is the obvious one, but climate change, all these huge global challenges which we can only deal with if the US and China can work together.